My name is Marian Whitlock, and on the day of my daughter-in-law's baby shower, I learned just how little I mattered to the people I had loved the most. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion filled with laughter, gifts, and family. The living room was decorated with pastel balloons and streamers, a mountain of presents stacked neatly in the corner. I had spent the past week carefully knitting a soft baby blanket, every stitch carrying memories of rocking my son to sleep when he was just a baby himself. I thought this day would be my chance to feel included again, to feel like a mother whose sacrifices had not been forgotten. But as I approached my daughter-in-law gift in hand, she turned to me with a tight smile that barely concealed her disdain. Then in front of everyone, her friends, her relatives, even my own son, she raised her voice and said the words that would echo in my mind for days afterward. "You don't belong here." The room fell silent. My son looked away, his face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't defend me. No one did. My hands trembled as I held the blanket I had made, the one I thought would wrap my grandchild in love. For a split second, I considered arguing back, demanding the respect I deserved. But the weight of years, the sacrifices, the quiet disappointments, the slow realization that my son had long drifted away held me still. I felt a wave of humiliation wash over me, as though every guest in that room saw me not as a mother or grandmother to be, but as an outsider. My heart pounded in my chest, not with anger, but with something far worse, grief. So I did the only thing I could do. I smiled faintly, placed the gift on the table, and walked out. No one stopped me, not even my son. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face and I felt tears welling up. I refused to let them fall, not yet. My footsteps were steady, even though my heart felt like it was breaking into 1,000 pieces. On the long drive home, I stared straight ahead, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The words kept replaying in my mind. "You don't belong here." I thought about all the times I had been there for my son, how I had worked 2 jobs to pay for his schooling, how I had skipped meals so he could eat, how I had never once asked for anything in return. And now, at the one moment when I had hoped to feel proud, to feel included, I was made to feel like a stranger in my own family. That night, sitting alone in my quiet house, I realized something. Begging for their love was no longer an option. I had spent too many years sacrificing myself for a son who no longer saw me as family. So I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't plead. I wouldn't fight for a seat at a table where I was no longer welcome. But this would not be the end of my story. I would let my silence speak louder than any argument ever could. What about you? Have you ever been made to feel invisible in your own family? Have you ever been pushed aside by the very people you raised and cared for? Tell me where you're watching from, and share your story in the comments. I read every single one. I drove home that night without music, without a single tear falling. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because my hurt was too deep for crying. It was the kind of pain that settles in your chest like a heavy stone, pressing down until breathing feels like a chore. When I stepped inside my house, the silence greeted me like an old friend. The faint scent of lavender from the candle I'd left on the kitchen counter still lingered. I placed my purse down, sat at the edge of the couch, and stared at the baby blanket I'd knitted, still folded neatly in the gift bag. I had taken it back when I left. Something in me couldn't bear to leave that piece of my love behind. The house felt colder than usual, though it was midsummer. Every photo on the wall, my son's school portraits, the family vacations, even his wedding picture seemed to mock me. They were snapshots of a life where I thought I belonged, a time when my son still looked at me as if I were his whole world. I thought of the boy who used to hold my hand in grocery stores, the teenager who called me mom with that mix of annoyance and affection, the young man who once thanked me for believing in him when no one else did. And now, he couldn't even look me in the eye as his wife humiliated me. I sat there for hours, my mind cycling through every memory, every sacrifice. I remembered the nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays because we couldn't afford to buy them. I remembered eating instant noodles for weeks so I could save enough money for his college application fees. I remembered smiling through exhaustion just to make sure he never saw how hard life really was. And for what? so he could stand silently while his wife told me I didn't belong. I should have been furious. I should have yelled, cursed, demanded answers. But I didn't. Instead, a strange calm washed over me, because for the first time I realized that my silence wasn't weakness, it was power. Words can be twisted, arguments can be spun into blame, but silence makes people wonder. It lingers in the air long after you leave, forcing them to face what they've done. Still, even as I tried to convince myself that I was strong, I couldn't ignore the sting of reality. At that moment, I wasn't a mother. I wasn't a grandmother to be. I was just a woman sitting alone in a house full of memories that no longer meant what they used to. I went to bed that night without turning on the light, but I barely slept. My mind kept drifting to one thought: if they could humiliate me so easily now, what would happen when I truly became old, when I became vulnerable? Would they push me aside completely? Would they let me fade away without a second thought? The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror. My silver hair framed a face that looked more tired than usual, but behind my eyes was something new. Resolve. If my son and his wife didn't value me, then I had to value myself. That was the day I decided I wouldn't beg for their affection. I wouldn't try to wedge myself into a life where I wasn't wanted. But walking away didn't mean disappearing. It meant taking back the power I didn't even realize I'd given up. I didn't know it then, but that quiet decision would be the first step toward a future none of them expected, a future where my silence would speak volumes. And when the day came, they would finally understand what it meant to lose me. The days that followed felt strangely empty, as if I were floating through someone else's life. I still went about my routines, watering the plants, making coffee, reading on the porch. But everything felt muted. My phone stayed silent. My son didn't call. My daughter-in-law didn't text. It was as if I'd been erased overnight. In that quiet, my mind wandered back to the years when my son Daniel was just a little boy. I could see him so clearly: his messy brown hair, his gap-toothed grin, the way he used to run to me after school shouting, "Mom." Guess what happened today? Those were the years when it was just the two of us against the world. His father left when Daniel was 3, and from that day on, I became both parents. I remembered the long nights at the diner refilling coffee cups for truck drivers just to make enough tips to pay the bills. I'd come home after midnight, my feet aching, only to find Daniel asleep on the couch waiting for me. He'd leave little notes on the table that said, "Love you, Mom." Those notes meant everything to me. They were proof that even though life was hard, we still had each other. When Daniel was 10, I worked 2 jobs to afford a cheap but safe apartment in a better school district. I spent hours helping him with homework even when my eyes were heavy with exhaustion. I told him every single day, "You can be anything you want to be. I believe in you." And he believed me. I was there when he got into college, the first in our family to ever do so. I cried when we drove to his dorm, proud and terrified all at once. I gave him nearly everything I had saved to pay for his books and fees, telling him, "Don't worry about me. Just focus on your future." I thought that future would include me, but somewhere along the way, as Daniel became a man, I became unnecessary. I wasn't the person he called when he got a promotion. I wasn't the first to know when he bought his house. And when he met Claire, my daughter-in-law, things shifted even more. She was polite at first, always with that practiced smile. But I saw the subtle ways she kept me at a distance. "Oh, Daniel and I already have plans. We'll let you know when we can visit." It wasn't obvious at first, but slowly I went from being included in everything to being included in nothing. The holidays became shorter visits. My phone calls went unanswered more often. And when they finally told me they were expecting a baby, I felt more like an afterthought than a cherished mother. I tried to tell myself that this was just how life worked, that children grow up, get married, and form new families. But that didn't mean I deserved to be humiliated. That night at the baby shower, when Claire told me I didn't belong, every memory of sacrifice and love came crashing down like a cruel joke. Because the truth is, I had been blind. I had been so busy, giving so desperate to still be needed, that I never saw how little space they were leaving for me. And yet in that realization, I felt something shift inside me. I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't force Daniel to love me the way he used to, but I could decide what my future would look like. And for the first time in years, I realized I didn't want my future to depend on them. I would always love my son. But love without respect is just another kind of heartbreak. As I folded the baby blanket and placed it in my dresser drawer, I whispered to myself, no more begging to belong. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way to reclaim my life without needing their approval, their invitations, or their love. And when that day came, they would finally understand what they had lost. In the days that followed, I began noticing things I had overlooked for years. It wasn't just the baby shower. Claire had been quietly excluding me from their lives for a long time, subtly, deliberately, and always, with that sugar-sweet tone that made it hard to call her out. There had been the Thanksgiving when she forgot to tell me they were hosting dinner at their new house. The birthday party for Daniel where I was invited last minute, after all the good seats were taken at the restaurant. The times she would correct me, "Oh, we don't do that anymore," as if my way of loving my son and future grandchild was somehow wrong. I started piecing together conversations I had overheard, moments that hadn't made sense before. Like when Claire once said to a friend, Daniel's mom means well, but she's just not part of our circle, not part of their circle. Those words stung, but they also opened my eyes. It wasn't just that Claire didn't like me. It was that she wanted me erased. I began paying closer attention even from afar. Through social media, I saw photos of family events I hadn't been invited to, barbecues, holiday gatherings, even their anniversary dinner. Claire always looked radiant, Daniel smiling at her side as if the life they built had no room for me. And Daniel, he went along with it. I realized that my son, the boy who once promised he'd take care of me forever, had let his wife redraw the lines of our family. At first, anger bubbled up inside me, but anger I knew would only eat me alive. So instead, I started to detach. I stopped being the first to call. I stopped sending little texts just to check in. I stopped offering to help with things I was never asked to help with. And the most shocking thing happened. No one noticed. That was when I understood just how far I had already been pushed out. But with that understanding came something else: clarity. I didn't need to fight to stay in their lives. Because maybe this was my chance to start living my own. Still, the pain was real. I would see the crib they had chosen for the baby in one of Claire's Instagram photos, and my heart would ache knowing I wasn't there to help put it together. I would hear a song on the radio that Daniel used to love as a boy, and wonder when he had stopped needing me. It hurt. It all hurt. But then something strange happened. The more I accepted my invisibility in their lives, the stronger I felt. I didn't realize it yet, but my quiet withdrawal was planting the seeds of a very different kind of power. A power that didn't need yelling or confrontation. A power that in time would make them face everything they had taken for granted. Because the truth was, they had built their lives on more than just love and effort. They had built it on my sacrifices. Sacrifices they had long forgotten. And someday soon they would remember. Weeks passed, and the silence between my son and me stretched longer and longer. Daniel didn't call. Claire didn't text. It was as if I had ceased to exist in their world, and yet I couldn't bring myself to break the silence first. But in that quiet, I started seeing my life with a new kind of clarity. Every corner of my house carried a memory of raising Daniel. The worn kitchen table where we ate pancakes on Sunday mornings. The hallway lined with his school pictures, from toothless smiles to his proud college graduation photo. These weren't just memories, they were proof of everything I had given. And then I realized something that both hurt and angered me. This very house, the one they always treated as my little place, had actually made their life possible. I had taken out a second mortgage years ago to pay for Daniel's college tuition and help him buy his first home. At the time, I told myself it was worth it. I wanted him to have the opportunities I never did. But in helping him, I had sacrificed my own security. I remembered sitting at the bank signing papers that would put me in debt for years, my hands shaking but my heart full of hope for Daniel's future. I never once asked for repayment. I never once reminded him of what I had done. Because that's what mothers do. But as I sat in my living room that evening, staring at the photo of Daniel holding the keys to his first house, I felt something inside me shift. I wasn't just a forgotten mother. I was the reason he even had the life he was living, and yet he and Claire treated me as if I were nothing. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I pulled out the old box of documents from the closet mortgage papers receipts, even the savings account records showing every transfer I'd made to Daniel over the years. The memories hit me like waves every check I wrote when money was tight, every time I told myself I'd buy something nice next year. Every dream I quietly gave up so he could chase his. Looking at those papers, I realized that all the sacrifices I made had one thing in common. I never asked for recognition. But now I finally understood that being silent about my worth was exactly why they had forgotten it. And that was about to change. Not with yelling. Not with dramatic confrontations. But with something far more powerful. Something that would remind them just how much of their life was built on my quiet sacrifices. Because the truth is, people forget too easily when you've given without ever asking, but they never forget the moment you finally stop. That night, for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of control return him. And I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. It was as though something inside me had shifted overnight, a quiet strength that had been buried for too long. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of papers I had pulled out the night before. Bank statements, mortgage records, copies of checks, all proof of the sacrifices I had made for Daniel. I realized I had been living my life as though I owed the world something, as though motherhood meant endless giving without ever asking for anything in return. But as I looked at those documents, a thought struck me like lightning. I had given enough. The house Daniel and Claire lived in, the one they treated as if it had always been theirs, was partly mine. My money, my sacrifice, my faith in Daniel had built the life they were living so comfortably now, and yet they acted as though I didn't belong. That phrase, "you don't belong here," rang in my head again, but this time it didn't hurt as much as it ignited something fierce inside me. I decided that day that I would stop trying to earn their love. Instead, I would quietly remind them of just how much of their world existed because of me. But I knew I couldn't do it impulsively. If I lashed out, I would be dismissed as bitter, dramatic, or overbearing. No, my power would be in preparation, not confrontation. So I began making a plan. The first step was organizing everything, every document, every receipt, every piece of proof that showed my role in Daniel's success. I bought a new binder neatly labeling each section: mortgage assistance, college funds, house down payment. With each paper I filed, I felt a strange mix of sadness and empowerment. Sadness that I had to go to these lengths to be valued. Empowerment because I was finally taking control of my story. That afternoon, I called an attorney, an old acquaintance from my teaching days, who had once been a parent of one of my students. I explained that I wasn't trying to start a fight, but that I wanted to understand my options. She listened carefully, then said something that stayed with me. "Marian, being silent all these years made them think you'd stay silent forever. But you still have rights. You just need to decide when and how to use them." Her words felt like both a warning and a gift. I didn't make any rash decisions that day. I simply gathered information quietly, learning what leverage I still had. And the more I learned, the more I realized I wasn't powerless. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time I wasn't just waiting for my son to love me again. I was preparing for a day when my silence would finally speak louder than all the years of sacrifice he had forgotten. And when that day came, Daniel and Claire would never see it coming. The days turned into weeks, and my plan slowly began to take shape. I didn't rush. Every step I took was deliberate, quiet, and careful. I spent mornings sorting through decades of financial papers, organizing them into neat folders. It was strange to see my entire life's sacrifices stacked so plainly in front of me, proof that nearly everything Daniel had achieved had been in part because of me. Each receipt told a story. The down payment on his first house money I'd pulled from my retirement savings. The tuition checks I wrote for his college education, sacrificing my own comfort so he could graduate debt-free. The countless small deposits into his account when he was just starting out. Quiet gestures of support I never mentioned to anyone. For years I'd told myself this is what mothers do. We give and we don't keep score. But now looking at all those numbers, I realized that my silence had made it far too easy for them to forget. I wasn't planning revenge, not yet. What I wanted was something far simpler. Acknowledgement. But deep down, I knew that if acknowledgement never came, I had the power to create a reminder they couldn't ignore. I started making small changes in my own life. First, I cut off the small acts of help I still gave them. The occasional grocery runs I paid for just to help. The birthday checks I sent every year without fail. The surprise bills I covered whenever Daniel mentioned things were tight. I stopped it all. At first there was no reaction, but then weeks later Daniel called. His tone was casual, but I heard the undertone of expectation. "Hey Mom, Claire and I are putting together the nursery. We're running a little short this month. Think you could help with some of the expenses?" It was a request I'd normally say yes to without hesitation. But this time, I simply said I can't help right now. There was a pause on the line, as if he couldn't quite believe my answer. "Oh, okay. No problem," he said quickly, his voice tight. I hung up the phone feeling a strange combination of guilt and freedom. Because for once, I wasn't giving out of obligation. And I realized just how much I'd been running on autopilot all these years, always saying yes, always putting myself last. In the evenings, I took long walks around my neighborhood, letting my thoughts wander. It felt as if a fog was slowly lifting from my life. The more distance I put between myself and their constant expectations, the more I began to feel like my own person again, not just a mother, not just a grandmother to be, but Marian. Still, I kept my plans close to my chest. No one knew what I was preparing. I wasn't sure yet how it would all play out. But I did know this. I wasn't going to beg for a place in their lives anymore. And when the time came for me to remind them of everything they owed me, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. My actions would be enough. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my own story. What they didn't know was that the next steps I would take, the ones they would never see coming, would change everything. One afternoon, I drove to the bank, the same one where I had signed the papers for Daniel's first mortgage years ago. The familiar smell of polished wood and faint ink hit me as I walked in, clutching the binder full of documents that had become my quiet weapon. The teller greeted me with a polite smile. "Mrs. Whitlock, how can we help you today?" I asked to speak with the loan officer who had handled my second mortgage all those years ago. To my surprise, she still worked there. When she saw me, her face lit up with recognition. "Marian." "It's been ages," she said warmly. We exchanged small talk, but soon I got to the point. I explained that I wanted copies of every transaction related to the mortgage I had taken out to help Daniel. She didn't ask many questions, just printed out everything I needed. When she slid the papers across the desk, I stared at them for a long moment. Each line was a quiet reminder of what I had given up: vacations. I never took repairs. I delayed on my own house. Small dreams I shelved away. And now here they were, all in black and white. Later that evening, as I organized everything neatly in my binder, I found myself smiling. Not a happy smile, but one of clarity. These papers weren't just proof of my sacrifices. They were my insurance. My voice in case anyone ever tried to erase me completely. Because Claire wasn't just excluding me from their lives, she was rewriting the story. I remembered overhearing her once say to a friend, "Daniel and I built everything we have on our own. We never had anyone's help." At the time, the comment had stung, but now it burned. Because it wasn't just a lie. It was a deliberate erasure of everything I had done. In the weeks that followed, I quietly started gathering more information. I called my attorney again, asking questions not about confrontation, but about what legal rights I still had to the house Daniel and Claire lived in. To my surprise, the lawyer told me that part of the arrangement for the down payment I had given Daniel had never been fully formalized, which meant that legally there was still a way for me to claim partial ownership. I didn't act right away. I didn't want to. Instead, I sat with that knowledge, letting it settle in. For years, I had told myself that motherhood meant giving without keeping score. But now I finally understood that my silence had made me invisible. And I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. I didn't tell Daniel or Claire anything. I stayed polite when Daniel called less frequently now, but enough to keep up appearances. He had no idea that while we were exchanging small talk about the baby's due date, I was sitting at my dining table surrounded by evidence of every sacrifice I had ever made for him. Every piece of paper was a quiet reminder. You would not have this life without me. And slowly my fear of being forgotten began to fade. Because I finally understood that when the time was right, they would be forced to remember. That night, I placed the binder in the top drawer of my desk. It felt heavy, not just in weight, but in meaning. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt ready. Ready for the day. They would finally see just how much of their lives were built on the back of my sacrifices. Sacrifices they had taken for granted for far too long. The more I organized my life, the more control I felt returning to me. I began to notice things I had ignored for years, small details that when pieced together revealed just how calculated Claire had been. It wasn't just exclusion anymore. It was manipulation. Through quiet conversations with a few family friends, I learned that Claire often spoke about how Daniel had to support me financially because I couldn't manage on my own. The implication was clear. I was a burden, someone to be pitied or tolerated. That lie had been eating away at my relationship with my son long before the baby shower. I started recalling other moments too, times when Claire would forget to pass along messages, moments when she corrected me in front of others as if I were out of touch, times she subtly painted me as someone who couldn't keep up with their modern lifestyle. Piece by piece, the puzzle became clearer. Claire wasn't just indifferent to me. She wanted to erase me. One evening, I pulled out my old journal, the one I had stopped writing in years ago because life had become too busy. As I flipped through the pages, I found notes I'd written to myself during Daniel's early adulthood. Gave Daniel money for rent again. He promised he'll pay me back soon. Covered his tuition gap. Had to skip fixing the roof this year. Paid for Daniel and Claire's wedding deposit. Told them it's my gift. Each entry stung, but it also fueled my resolve. I wasn't bitter about helping him mother's help. But it was the lack of gratitude, the rewriting of history that cut the deepest. A few days later, Daniel called again. Hey, Mom. Claire's baby shower pictures came out great. I'll send you some, he said, his tone oddly casual. I braced myself as I heard him mention almost as an afterthought. Claire's parents are helping us cover some costs for the baby's room. It's nice having them around, they're so supportive. The words were like a quiet knife. I almost reminded him of everything I had done, everything I had given up. But I didn't. Instead, I replied softly, That's nice, Daniel. I'm glad you have help. He had no idea that as we spoke, my binder of documents sat open on the table, evidence of every silent sacrifice that had kept him afloat. That night, I met with my lawyer again. This time, I didn't just ask questions. We reviewed options about the ownership of the house, about my financial stake, about what I was legally entitled to if I decided to make a move. The lawyer looked at me with quiet admiration and said, Marian, you've been underestimated for far too long. You have more power than they realize. Those words stayed with me, because for the first time I believed them. As I drove home under the orange glow of the streetlights, I thought about the baby who would soon be born, my grandchild. I had hoped to be part of their life, to hold them, to rock them to sleep the way I once did with Daniel. But Claire had made her feelings clear. I wasn't wanted. And if that was the life they wanted to build without me, then I would let them. But I would no longer be the invisible foundation holding it all together. By the time I parked in my driveway, the decision was already forming in my heart. I wouldn't act yet. Not until the time was right. But when I did, it would be quiet. It would be final. And it would remind them that the woman they thought they could erase had always been the reason they had everything in the first place. It was a Saturday morning when everything finally came together. I sat at my dining table, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, the binder open in front of me. Every page told the story of my sacrifices, dates, amounts, signatures. It was all there, undeniable. I ran my fingers over the papers, thinking about how naive I had been. I had believed that love was enough to keep a family together. I had believed that giving endlessly quietly would make me irreplaceable. But life had proven otherwise. Daniel and Claire didn't just forget what I'd done for them. They had rewritten history, painting themselves as entirely self-made, while I became a burden in their narrative. That morning, I realized I didn't have to beg for recognition anymore, 'cause I already had the proof. Later that day, I visited my lawyer again, binder in hand. We sat across from each other as she reviewed everything I'd collected. "Marian," she said softly, "you have a stronger claim than most mothers ever do in situations like this. You didn't just give out of generosity. You legally contributed to their home. And since there's no written agreement stating it was a gift, you still hold leverage." I listened quietly as she outlined my options I had never even considered. If I wanted, I could legally assert partial ownership of Daniel and Claire's house. I could require repayment for the funds I'd given for Daniel's education, which had been documented through bank transfers marked loan in the memo line. I could even restrict certain assets from being accessed if my name was still tied to them. For a moment, guilt washed over me. I pictured Daniel as a little boy again, grinning as he held up the macaroni necklace he'd made for me in kindergarten. I pictured his proud face when he got his college acceptance letter. But then I remembered standing in that baby shower humiliated, as Claire told me I didn't belong. And I remembered Daniel, my son, staying silent. That night, I pulled out an old photo album. I stared at the pictures of a life I had built for my son, the Christmas mornings, the birthdays, the graduation cap and gown. And for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt ready, not to destroy him, but to remind them both that behind every choice they made, behind every comfort they enjoyed, was a mother who had given everything. I didn't act right away. Instead, I began to plan not for revenge, but for justice. Because there was a difference. I would not scream, argue, or demand apologies. I would let the truth backed by evidence speak for itself. The next morning, as I placed the binder back in its drawer, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know exactly how or when it would happen, but I knew this much. When the moment came, Daniel and Claire would finally see me not as a burden, not as someone to erase, but as the very foundation of everything they had. And that realization would change everything. The weeks that followed felt like the calm before a storm, but this time, I was the one holding the thunder. Daniel still called occasionally, but our conversations were shallow. He'd ask about my health, about whether I was doing okay, but his words felt more like obligation than genuine care. Claire never spoke to me directly anymore, and I had long stopped expecting her to. But I noticed something interesting. The moment I stopped offering help, they began to struggle in small ways. Daniel hinted at money being tight. Claire posted vague social media updates about how hard it is to prepare for a baby without enough support. I said nothing. It was strange, almost liberating to realize how much they had relied on my quiet generosity. One evening, Daniel called. His tone was careful, as if he were testing the waters. "Mom," he began, "Claire and I are trying to finish the nursery. We've maxed out a couple of cards. Is there any way you could lend us something just for now?" For years, my answer would have been an immediate yes. But this time, I let the silence linger before replying. "Daniel," I said gently, "I'm not in a position to help right now." The pause on the line stretched uncomfortably. "Oh, I understand," he said, though. I could hear the frustration beneath his words. We ended the call, and I set my phone down with trembling hands, not from guilt, but from the strange empowerment of finally saying no. That night, I went through my binder again, double-checking every document, every signature. The lawyer had helped me draft a quiet legal plan, a way to secure my rights to the portion of the house that was rightfully mine. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. I didn't want to take their home, but I wanted them to understand without question that they had built their life on my sacrifices, and that erasing me came with consequences. A week later, I took the final step. I signed the paperwork that would officially place a claim on my share of the house. It wasn't dramatic, just a few signatures notarized and filed. When I left the lawyer's office, I stood outside for a long moment, breathing in the crisp air. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. For the first time, I wasn't the woman waiting to be appreciated. I was the woman who had quietly taken back her power. Daniel and Claire didn't know yet, but soon they would. And when that day came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or say a single bitter word. The truth stamped and notarized would say everything for me. It happened sooner than I expected. Daniel called me one evening, his voice tight the way it always was when he was nervous. "Mom, we got a letter in the mail today. It says you filed a claim on our house. What's going on?" I stayed silent for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Yes, Daniel," I said calmly. "I did." There was a long pause. Then incredulously, "Why would you do that?" "Claire is... she's furious. She says you're trying to ruin us right before the baby comes." I closed my eyes and took a steady breath. "Daniel," I said softly, "everything you have, the house, your education, the life you built, it came from me. I never asked for recognition. I never asked for repayment. But when Claire told me I didn't belong in your lives, it became clear you both forgot where you came from." "Mom, that's not fair," he started, but I cut him off. "Fair? Daniel, for years I gave everything I had. I sacrificed my own future so you could have yours. And I've been erased from your life as though none of that mattered. I won't fight for your affection anymore, but I will not let you erase me." There was nothing but silence on the line after that. The next day, Claire called me directly. Her voice was sharp, almost venomous. "How could you do this to us? We're about to have a baby." I kept my tone level. "Claire, you told me I didn't belong? You made sure I was excluded from every part of Daniel's life. I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because I deserve to be seen. My sacrifices deserve to be remembered." She scoffed, muttered something under her breath, and hung up. For days afterward, I heard nothing. Then Daniel showed up at my house unannounced. He stood in the doorway looking like a man torn in two. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't realize. I never thought about how much you did for me. Claire said you just gave money because you wanted to. I didn't think it mattered anymore." I looked at him, my heart aching. "It mattered, Daniel. It always mattered. But you let her convince you that I was just an obligation, that I didn't belong. I can forgive you for forgetting me, but I won't let you forget what I've done." He didn't argue. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time in years, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who adored me, who believed I was the strongest person in the world. But it was too late to go back. I had already taken the steps to reclaim my power, and I wasn't going to undo them. As he left, I felt both sorrow and relief. Sorrow because my son finally understood, but only when forced to. Relief because for once I hadn't stayed silent. And soon everyone would know the truth. That the woman they tried to erase was the very reason they had everything. After Daniel left my house that evening, I sat alone in the quiet, staring at the front door long after it closed. The air felt heavy, as if the entire house had absorbed years of unspoken words. For so long I had believed that silence was a form of love, that by not keeping score, I was protecting our bond. But now I saw the truth. My silence had only taught them to forget me. The following week, I received a call from my lawyer. "Marian, I've received responses from Daniel and Claire's attorney. They're shocked at how much evidence you have of your financial contributions." A part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt a dull ache. I didn't want this fight. I had never wanted to see my son on the other side of a legal table. But this wasn't revenge. This was acknowledgement. Claire reached out again, this time with a different tone. She tried to sound reasonable, but every word was laced with resentment. "Look, Marian," she said, "we can work this out. But doing this right now while we're about to have a baby, it's cruel. Families don't do this to each other." I almost laughed at the irony. Families also don't humiliate their elders in front of strangers. Families don't erase the very person who sacrificed everything for them. I stayed calm. "Claire, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because I won't let you erase me from my own story." She didn't reply. 2 days later, Daniel showed up again, this time without warning, without Claire. He stood in my living room looking around as if he hadn't been there in years. His eyes fell on the framed photo of him in his cap and gown. My arm around him, pride written all over my face. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't know what to say. I can't defend what Claire said to you at the shower. And I can't defend myself either. I waited. You've always been there for me, he continued. And I took it for granted. We both did. There was something in his voice, regret maybe, but I didn't let it sway me. Daniel, I said softly, love isn't just about saying thank you. It's about remembering. You forgot who stood behind you all those years. And I forgot that I deserved better. He sat down across from me, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how to fix this. Claire, she doesn't see what I see now. She still thinks you're just trying to punish us. I met his gaze. This isn't punishment. This is truth. And sometimes the truth feels like punishment when you've ignored it too long. He didn't argue. He just nodded, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of years had finally settled on him. When he left that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired but stronger. Because for the first time, Daniel was finally seeing me, not as a burden, but as the foundation of everything he had. And that realization, the one he had fought so hard to avoid, was only just beginning to sink in. The following week, I received a call from my lawyer. Marian, they're ready to settle. They don't want this to go to court. I sat in silence for a long moment before replying. What does that mean? They're willing to formally recognize your financial stake in the house, she explained. Your contributions will be acknowledged in writing, and you'll be given the legal authority to reclaim that money if the house is ever sold. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. But seeing it in writing, seeing proof that my sacrifices mattered, felt like a weight had lifted from my chest. That evening, Daniel came over alone again. He handed me a document folder, his expression a mix of guilt and relief. Mom, it's all in there. Everything you did, it's acknowledged now. I'm sorry it had to come to this for me to see it. I opened the folder and read the papers slowly. For the first time, every check I'd written, every payment I'd made, every piece of my life I'd given away, was laid out clearly, no longer invisible. I looked up at Daniel. His eyes were red, his voice breaking. I should have defended you that day, he whispered. I should have stood up for you. You should have, I said softly. But you didn't, and that's why I had to stand up for myself. Daniel nodded, unable to meet my eyes. Claire still thinks you're punishing us. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm just making sure I'm not erased. That's all. As he left that night, I felt both sorrow and freedom. Sorrow, because nothing would ever be the same between us. Freedom, because I had finally done what I should have done long ago, stopped begging for a place in a life where I was never truly welcomed. For the first time in years, I slept soundly. I had no regrets. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't lashed out. I had simply acted. And that quiet act had finally made them see me. The morning after the settlement was finalized, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun rise over my quiet street. For the first time in a long while, the air felt lighter, as if the weight I had carried for decades had finally lifted. I wasn't triumphant. There was no gloating, no bitterness, just peace. Because I had finally done what I'd been too afraid to do for so many years. I had stood up for myself without screaming, without begging, without waiting for someone else to validate my worth. A week later, Daniel visited again. He looked different this time. Tired, humbled. Mom, he said softly, Claire and we've been talking. I know I can't undo what's happened, but I want you to be part of the baby's life. I want you there. I studied him carefully. I'll be there if you truly want me there, not out of guilt, but because you choose to remember who I am to you. He swallowed hard, nodding. I do. I remember now. When the baby was born, I held my grandchild in my arms for the first time. Tiny fingers curled around mine, warm and fragile. Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet triumph of knowing I hadn't disappeared. I had taken back my place not by force, but by finally valuing myself enough to demand recognition. Life didn't become perfect after that. Claire was still distant, still cold. But Daniel, he tried, slowly, painfully, he tried to rebuild what he had let slip away. And I let him, not because I needed him to love me again, but because I had learned something far more important. That my worth was never meant to be defined by their acceptance. To anyone listening now, don't wait until you're erased to realize your value. Silence can be powerful, but only if you choose it as strength, not surrender. I chose silence not to disappear, but to act in a way that could never be ignored. And in the end, that silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever given so much only to be forgotten? Tell me where you're watching from. Share your story. I read every single comment. And if this story meant something to you, please subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because sometimes the quietest voices deserve to be heard the loudest.